The frost-covered fields of Europe lay silent as dawn broke. In the distance, a low rumble crept across the horizon, not thunder, but steel. German soldiers, once so sure of their invincibility, peered through the morning mist and saw something they had never expected. Tanks burning from the front, aircraft striking deep inside their homeland, supply lines crushed by sheer industrial force. For years, the Wehrmacht had swept across continents with speed, discipline, and terrifying efficiency. But now, a new force was rising, one built on innovation, production, and relentless adaptation. From the skies above Berlin to the hedgerows of Normandy, from the frozen Ardennes to assembly lines in Detroit, the balance of power was shifting. This is the story of that turning point, when German troops, pilots, and commanders alike were forced to confront weapons, strategies, and industrial might unlike anything they had imagined. If you love deep World War II storytelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It helps bring more untold stories to life. In the early years of the war, the skies above Europe belonged to the Luftwaffe. German pilots flew with unmatched precision, their aircraft slicing through the clouds like blades through silk. They hunted in tight formations, disciplined, fast, and lethal. Allied bombers that dared to enter German airspace were often met with devastating ambushes. German aces became legends. Their kill counts were whispered across Europe with a mix of awe and dread. But by 1944, that sky was changing. The Allied bombing campaign had grown relentless. Waves of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed the English Channel almost daily, their contrails drawing pale white scars against the morning blue. Factories, oil plants, and railway yards deep inside the Reich became daily targets. At first, German fighters intercepted with confidence. They knew the bombers were powerful but vulnerable. Without fighter escorts, they could be picked apart. For a time, that strategy worked. Luftwaffe pilots attacked from above and head-on, exploiting the bombers' weak spots. Entire formations could be broken by a well-coordinated strike. But then came the change, quiet at first, almost invisible, until it wasn't. From the west, new silhouettes began to appear in the skies. Sleek, fast, silver. The P-51 Mustang. Unlike the earlier Allied fighters, the Mustang could follow bombers deep into German territory and still have the range to fight. It didn't just protect the bombers, it hunted the hunters. On a cold morning in late winter, a German pilot climbed into his Messerschmitt Bf-109. He'd flown dozens of missions. He trusted his machine, his training, and the sky he had once ruled. As his plane lifted into the pale light, he saw the distant black dots of approaching bombers. Another day, another interception. But as his squadron reached altitude, something unexpected happened. From above the bomber formations, Mustangs dropped out of the sun in perfect dives. Their engines roared as they accelerated, their 5.0 caliber machine guns flashing. German formations broke apart in confusion. The hunters were being hunted. For German pilots, it was like fighting a different war. The Mustang's speed and maneuverability rivaled their own, but its endurance was unmatched. Even after long climbs and fierce dogfights, it stayed in the fight. Luftwaffe squadrons found themselves engaged earlier, pushed harder, and pursued deeper than ever before. The psychological shock was immediate. Veteran German aces who once toyed with bombers now had to look over their shoulders constantly. New pilots, rushed into service as attrition mounted, were thrown into skies dominated by Allied air power. Day after day, bomber streams crossed into German airspace, and now they were protected every step of the way. Industrial cities that once lay beyond the safe reach of Allied fighters now burned under daylight raids. Oil fields, aircraft plants, and rail hubs were pounded without mercy. The Luftwaffe responded with bravery and skill. But skill alone could not offset exhaustion, dwindling fuel, and a relentless enemy that grew stronger with each passing month. The Mustang wasn't just another airplane. It was a turning point. By the summer of 1944, Luftwaffe losses were rising sharply. Many of Germany's most experienced pilots were gone. The replacements came with fewer flight hours, less training, and little chance to survive long enough to learn. The once invincible hunters of the Reich were now outnumbered, outflanked, and outgunned, often over their own homeland. The sky, once theirs, was slipping away. The cold morning mist clung to the edges of the hedgerows as if reluctant to leave. Along narrow French roads, German armored columns creaked forward, steel beasts growling under their breath. Their tracks crushed gravel and damp earth, leaving behind a trail of churned mud and confidence. To the seasoned German tank crews, the battlefield was their domain. For years, their panzers had carved through Europe like a sharpened blade. But on this day, something new awaited them, something silent, light, and deadly. From the shadows of shattered farmhouses and roadside ditches, American infantrymen watched the columns approach. They were young, cold and tense, their breaths visible in the air. Clutched in their hands were long, tube-shaped weapons that had arrived on the front lines just months before. The M1 bazooka, a weapon that would rewrite battlefield equations. Crude at first glance, its metal tube looked nothing like the thick armor plating of a panzer. But inside, it carried a shaped charge capable of slicing through steel like a hot knife through butter. The German crews, perched high in their turrets, didn't see them. Why would they? For years, infantry had been powerless against tanks, unless they had artillery or other armor backing them. They advanced confidently, radios crackling in short, disciplined bursts. Orders were clear. Push forward, crush resistance, secure the crossroad. The familiar rhythm of mechanized war played out like a well-rehearsed song. Then, the silence broke. A flash erupted from the hedgerow, grief, bright and devastating. A streak of smoke cut across the road, hissing through the air before slamming into the lead panzer. There was a heartbeat of stillness, then an eruption of flame. The shaped charge focused its explosive force into a narrow jet that tore through armor, igniting fuel and ammunition inside. The mighty tank shuddered, flames licking out through the hatches like a dragon gasping its last breath. The Germans were stunned. This wasn't artillery from afar. This was close, intimate, invisible, until it struck. Commanders barked orders, turrets swung wildly, and machine guns stitched the hedgerows with bullets. But the bazooka teams had already shifted position, melting back into the landscape like ghosts. One after another, shots rang out from unexpected angles. A convoy, designed to punch through defensive lines, suddenly found itself ambushed by nimble infantry. Bazookas struck at side armor, rear armor, the soft spots the Germans had once assumed were unreachable. Smoke thickened over the road, mingling with the morning mist. creating a surreal battlefield where fire bloomed like unnatural flowers. For the German soldiers, it was more than just a tactical surprise. It was psychological shock. The tank, once the symbol of unstoppable power, was now vulnerable to a weapon that could be carried by a single man. Their armored columns, long accustomed to spearheading assaults with little fear of infantry, suddenly found themselves facing a weapon they didn't fully understand. Radios filled with panic, coordinates were scrambled, and platoons halted their advance to reassess. Nearby American officers watched carefully. This was the weapon they had hoped would change the tide. The bazooka wasn't perfect. It had its flaws, misfires, and limited range. But when used with courage and cunning, it turned quiet country roads into tank traps. Soldiers who had once felt powerless against armor now held the means to bring it to its knees. As the smoke drifted upward, the battlefield changed. German armored doctrine, built on the assumption of infantry inferiority, was facing a new reality. And this was only the beginning. The road was no longer a path of conquest. It had become a graveyard of steel. Burning tanks lined the narrow lanes, their twisted hulls glowing like embers against the gray sky. The air was heavy with the scent of scorched fuel and wet earth. Birds that had once sung at dawn now circled overhead in uneasy silence. For the German crews trapped inside their machines, the once reliable armor felt like a coffin. Hatches were flung open, men leapt from flaming vehicles, some stumbling through smoke, others not making it out at all. American infantry moved like shadows through the hedgerows, reloading their bazookas with trembling but determined hands. Many of them had never faced tanks at such close range. Their hearts pounded in their chests, the roar of engines and gunfire mixing with their own breath. They weren't just soldiers, they were hunters now, stalking iron beasts with tubes of steel slung over their shoulders. The balance between man and machine had shifted in a way few could have imagined only months earlier. German officers scrambled to reassert control. Through static-filled radios came hurried commands, each more desperate than the last. Tanks were ordered to fan out, infantry to push into the tree line, artillery to respond if possible. But this wasn't the open steppe of Eastern Europe or the wide plains of France during the Blitzkrieg. This was bocage country. Tight, winding, full of natural cover that swallowed tanks whole. Every turn of the road could conceal another team, another waiting shot. It wasn't just a fight. It was a hunt in a maze designed by nature and sharpened by war. In one sector, a Panzer IV tried to reverse, its driver panicking as smoke poured from the wrecks ahead. But as it backed up, another flash tore through the fog, another bazooka round, this time slamming into its rear armor. The detonation sent shrapnel flying, the crew's screams lost beneath the roar of the engines. Nearby German infantry, exposed without proper cover, fired wildly into hedgerows, their discipline fraying. For years they had trained to advance behind the comfort of armor. Now, with that shield cracking, fear began to seep into their ranks. American soldiers watched and learned. Each successful strike fed their courage. They moved in pairs and small teams, whispering, signaling, waiting for tanks to enter narrow choke points before unleashing their fire.
The bazooka was not just a weapon. It was a psychological equalizer. It allowed lightly armed men to challenge an armored column and win, not through brute strength, but through precision, patience, and daring. As the engagement wore on, German formations stalled completely. What was meant to be a rapid push through rural roads had devolved into chaos. Commanders peered through periscopes and narrow vision slits, unable to spot the enemy clearly, firing blind into the mist. The very terrain they had underestimated was now their enemy, funneling them into traps they couldn't avoid. Night began to fall, and the once clear objectives faded with the light. Columns meant to advance miles now sat smoldering in place, their path blocked by burning metal and unseen foes. Somewhere in the distance, church bells echoed faintly through the smoke, an eerie reminder of a civilian world caught between empires at war. This battle was more than just a skirmish. It was the awakening of a new kind of warfare, one where the giant could be slain by the determined few. The Germans would adapt, they always did, but in that moment, as fires raged and the night swallowed the countryside, the American bazooka teams had delivered a message written in flame and steel. The age of unchecked armor was ending.
Darkness spread like ink over the countryside, and with it came a chilling silence. The thundering engines, the sharp crack of bazookas, the cries of men, it all began to fade, replaced by the occasional distant explosion and the low hiss of burning vehicles. The battlefield, once alive with movement, now lay frozen in a kind of dreadful stillness. Smoke rose in slow, ghostly columns. Darkness spread like ink over the countryside, and with it came a chilling silence. The thundering engines, the sharp crack of bazookas, the cries of men, it all began to fade, replaced by the occasional distant explosion and the low hiss of burning vehicles. The battlefield, once alive with movement, now lay frozen in a kind of dreadful stillness. Smoke rose in slow, ghostly columns, curling into the night sky like the remnants of some ancient ritual. The hedgerows, illuminated by flickering fires, cast jagged shadows that seemed to move on their own. For the German tank crews, the night brought little comfort. Inside their armored shells, they sat tense, listening for footsteps in the darkness. Bazooka teams could be anywhere. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig became a threat. Men whispered urgently, their breath visible in the cool night air. Officers pored over maps by dim lanterns, trying to make sense of a situation that had spiraled beyond control. The confident advance that had begun earlier in the day had turned into a desperate standoff, their vaunted machines reduced to hulking silhouettes against a landscape they no longer commanded. Meanwhile, the American soldiers did not rest. Under cover of night, small teams moved like wraiths through the fields. They repositioned, resupplied, and prepared for the next push. Some quietly reloaded their bazookas, checking each rocket by touch in the darkness. Others whispered plans, pointing to gaps in the column where a single well-placed shot could block an entire route of retreat. For many of these men, this was their first true taste of night combat against tanks. Fear was there, palpable, undeniable, but so was determination. They had seen the enemy bleed. They knew their weapons worked. In command posts farther back, German radio operators struggled to maintain contact with forward elements. Messages were broken, laced with panic, punctuated by bursts of static. "We're surrounded. Tanks disabled. Cannot advance." Higher command issued orders to regroup and hold until daylight, but daylight felt like an eternity away. The panzers, which had once embodied unstoppable momentum, now sat idle, boxed in by terrain and enemy tactics they had failed to anticipate. The psychological tide was shifting. German infantrymen, who had once marched confidently behind their tanks, now crouched nervously in ditches, staring into the blackness. The once overwhelming presence of armor had always been their shield, their symbol of superiority. But as one tank after another burned, that shield fractured. Whispers spread through the ranks, rumors of entire columns destroyed by invisible teams, of rockets striking from impossible angles. Fear crept into the bones of men who rarely knew doubt. On the American side, there was a quiet, almost reverent energy. The soldiers had witnessed something transformative. They were not merely reacting, they were shaping the battle. The bazooka, once doubted by many, even within their own ranks, had proven its worth. In these close, suffocating landscapes, it wasn't sheer firepower that decided the night. It was cunning, teamwork, and courage. Somewhere near the front, a lone German officer climbed onto the hull of his immobilized tank. He stared into the darkness, hands gripping cold steel, listening. He could hear them out there, small movements, whispers, the faint clatter of weapons being readied. He knew they were waiting. His men looked to him for orders, for some sign that this night wouldn't end in ruin, but there were no easy commands left to give. And so, in the darkness, in a shadowy part of Europe, the battle for the days of armored warfare would not be so easy.
At dawn, the first light crept across the battered countryside like a hesitant witness. Smoke hung low over the fields, hugging the hedgerows and roads, mingling with a faint mist that had rolled in overnight. The rising sun revealed a scene both majestic and tragic. Rows of steel giants blackened by fire, their once mighty frames twisted and silent. The German armored columns, designed to project unstoppable power, now looked like relics of a lost age. Crows perched on gun barrels, their cries echoing through the cold morning air like the tolling of distant bells. For the Germans, the new day brought clarity and dread. Officers emerged from command posts with drawn faces, scanning the battlefield through binoculars. What they saw was a grim mosaic of shattered momentum. Tanks that were supposed to spearhead breakthroughs now blocked their own roads, their hulks forming unintended barricades. The narrow lanes of the bocage had become steel traps. Even experienced panzer commanders struggled to find words for their reports. They had underestimated the terrain, the enemy's adaptability, and above all, the psychological weapon now in American hands. The American lines stirred to life with disciplined energy. Bazooka teams, having spent the night repositioning, now prepared for the possibility of a counterattack. Infantry officers moved briskly between hedgerows, issuing quiet orders. Artillery observers climbed into trees and onto rooftops, scanning for any signs of renewed German movement. There was no celebration, no cheering, just the steady rhythm of soldiers who understood that one victory was not the end. The Germans were wounded, not destroyed, and everyone knew they would strike back with fury. Further back, German engineers worked feverishly to clear wrecked vehicles from the roads. They attached chains to tanks, trying to pull them aside, but progress was slow. Each disabled panzer was a logistical nightmare. Recovery vehicles were scarce, and under the threat of hidden bazooka teams, every movement came with risk. Officers barked orders, their frustration cutting through the morning air. Some crews tried to repair damaged tracks in the mud, their hands numb from the cold. Others abandoned their machines entirely, retreating on foot to regroup. American commanders recognized an opportunity. The success of the bazooka ambush had not just blunted the German advance, it had cracked open a gap in their confidence. Orders spread quickly through radio channels. Maintain pressure, exploit weaknesses, but avoid overextension. Patience was key. Unlike the rapid armored thrusts that had defined German blitzkrieg tactics, the American approach here was methodical, calculated. They knew the terrain favored them, and for once the enemy was reacting instead of dictating. In the air above, Allied reconnaissance planes appeared, their engines droning softly as they circled the smoke-filled landscape. From their vantage point, the devastation was clear. Entire stretches of road clogged with vehicles, smoke trails marking the path of retreating forces. Photographs were taken, positions noted, artillery coordinates updated. This was combined arms warfare in motion, infantry with bazookas, supported by eyes in the sky, and artillery poised to strike. Among the German ranks, whispers turned to quiet resentment. Some blamed intelligence failures, others cursed the terrain. A few, under their breath, admitted something they would not have dared a year earlier. The Americans were learning fast. They were no longer the inexperienced soldiers of North Africa. These men had adapted, and their weapons, once dismissed as inferior, were reshaping the battlefield in real time. The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, but not the smoke. The crackle of distant gunfire signaled skirmishes along the flanks. Both sides were gathering themselves for the next phase of the fight. The Germans would try to break out, to regain momentum, to show that their panzers still commanded fear. The Americans, steady and relentless, prepared to meet them with the same weapon that had stunned them the day before.
In that quiet moment between battles, as soldiers on both sides readied for what was to come, one truth became clear. The age of armored invincibility had been pierced. The bazooka was not merely a weapon of destruction, it was a symbol of changing tides. And in the fields of Europe, those tides were beginning to turn. The Germans were not a force accustomed to hesitation. For years, their doctrine had been built on shock, speed, and precision. Overwhelm the enemy before he could adapt. But on this morning, hesitation crept into their movements like frost on a window pane. Commanders huddled over field maps, tracing routes with gloved fingers, trying to find paths that bypassed the kill zones of the previous night. Radio messages flowed back and forth between forward observers and armored units, but there was a subtle shift in tone. Gone was the confident, clipped language of a force on the offensive. In its place came cautious words, measured movements, and an unspoken understanding. They were walking into unfamiliar ground. At the edges of the battlefield, German infantry began to probe forward. Small squads advanced through the hedgerows, scanning the tree lines with sharp eyes, rifles at the ready. They expected resistance, but couldn't tell where it would come from. The bocage was a labyrinth, a place where a single bend in the road could hide an entire ambush team. In the distance, engines growled as panzer crews restarted their machines, lining them up for a renewed push. The plan was simple on paper: clear the roads, flank the American positions, and punch through with concentrated force. But paper plans rarely survive contact with evolving reality. American bazooka teams waited in silence, concealed within the thick vegetation. They had learned the rhythm of German movement, the grinding of gears before a turn, the way infantry spread just ahead of the tanks. They adjusted their positions accordingly, setting up new angles of firing, checking their ammunition.
Some soldiers whispered quiet prayers. Others stared into the distance, gripping their launchers tightly. There was no bravado here, only resolve. The first panzers rolled forward cautiously, their turrets swiveling from side to side, coaxing their way down narrow lanes. The infantry spread out, moving slowly, rifles scanning. A few shots cracked through the morning air as they flushed out a lone American scout. But the real threat was still hidden. The Germans advanced deeper, believing they might have cleared the area. That's when the first bazooka team struck. A sharp whoosh cut through the air, followed by a thunderous impact. The lead tank lurched to a halt as smoke and flame erupted from its side. Shouts rang out, orders barked, and within seconds the column's careful formation disintegrated. Infantry scrambled for cover, tanks reversed awkwardly in the confined lanes, and radios crackled with overlapping voices. Another shot came from a different angle, striking a second tank near the rear. The Germans were caught again, not by superior numbers, but by patience and precision. Artillery observers, perched in hidden vantage points, saw the column bunch up and relayed coordinates. Within minutes, American artillery opened up, shells whistling overhead before crashing into the roads and fields. The hedgerows that had concealed bazooka teams now echoed with the deep concussions of heavy guns. Dirt and metal flew into the air, and the German advance dissolved into chaos once more. For the German tank crews, this was a nightmare scenario. Their panzers were powerful on open ground, where maneuver and firepower reigned supreme. But here, in the twisting countryside, they were like trapped beasts, unable to bring their full strength to bear, vulnerable to attacks from unseen angles. Each bazooka strike wasn't just physical damage, it was psychological. Crews began to imagine enemies behind every hedge, every barn, every copse of trees. American commanders sensed the panic and pressed their advantage. Infantry units pushed forward in small, coordinated groups, harassing the German flanks. Machine gun nests opened up, pinning infantry while bazooka teams repositioned. It wasn't a grand offensive. It was a methodical, relentless pressure. A death by 1,000 cuts. The German response grew more frantic. Smoke screens were deployed to obscure movement, but in the confined lanes, they only added to the confusion. Some tank commanders dismounted to direct their vehicles by hand, waving frantically through the haze. Others ordered their crews to hold positions and fire blindly into suspected ambush zones. But the Americans didn't take the bait. They waited, patient and disciplined, striking only when a target presented itself. As the sun climbed higher, the battlefield became a study in contrast. German might struggling to find momentum. American ingenuity slowly tightening the noose. The lesson was becoming clear to both sides. In this new kind of war, brute strength was no longer enough. Adaptation, quick, clever, ruthless, was the deciding factor.
The German High Command had not anticipated this. Their armored columns, forged in the fires of blitzkrieg and refined across countless campaigns, were designed to break through static lines, not to fight unseen enemies hidden in every thicket and fold of the land. Reports flooded in from forward units, confusing, fragmented, sometimes contradicting each other entirely. Some claimed they were surrounded. Others reported enemy armor that did not exist. In truth, it wasn't tanks surrounding them. It was silence, patience, and the cunning of small teams who understood their terrain better than any map could ever show. Along one narrow country lane, a panzer commander peered through his periscope. The glass was smeared with soot and dirt, but he could still make out the broken forms of two wrecked tanks up ahead. The air shimmered with the heat of still burning fires. Every instinct told him to push forward, to keep the offensive alive. But the terrain whispered caution. He glanced at his crew, their faces pale, hands gripping their controls with a nervous edge. They weren't rookies. They had survived the Eastern Front. But here, something was different. The enemy wasn't throwing waves of men or artillery at them. They were waiting, watching. In the nearby hedgerows, American soldiers crouched low. Their uniforms were damp from the morning dew, their fingers stiff from gripping launchers for hours, but their eyes were sharp. They had studied the patterns of German movement all morning. Every engine rev, every grinding of gears was a signal. Some were veterans of earlier campaigns, others new to the fight. But all shared a single understanding. They held the advantage in these tight spaces. The bazooka, simple and almost crude compared to the panzer's complex engineering, had become their equalizer. Another tank moved forward to clear the road, its engine growling as it pushed debris aside. The Germans had started to use infantry more aggressively to screen their armor, sending men ahead to flesh out potential ambushes. But even that had its limits. In one corner of the field, a small American team spotted an opportunity. They let the infantry pass, staying hidden. When the tank entered the kill zone, they fired. The rocket struck the underside of the turret ring, a vulnerable point. The explosion was devastating. The tank's turret jammed, smoke pouring from its hatches. The German infantry ahead turned in panic, realizing too late what had happened. Radio chatter exploded across the German network. Commands overlapped, voices rose in panic, positions became confused. Units meant to support each other were scattered, each caught in their own isolated fights. This wasn't the fluid, synchronized advance that German doctrine relied upon. It was a series of disconnected struggles. Each tank and squad left to fend for itself in a hostile maze. From the air, Allied reconnaissance observed the growing disarray. Photographs captured columns bunching up, tanks stuck in choke points, infantry pinned down by invisible enemies. These images would later be studied by commanders who understood that what they were witnessing was more than just a tactical engagement. It was a shift in the nature of armored warfare itself. Meanwhile, American artillery intensified its bombardment. Shells fell not in massive barrages, but in carefully timed strikes. Every time a German unit tried to regroup or push through, a new rain of steel descended on their positions. It wasn't overwhelming firepower. It was surgical pressure, applied again and again until the formation cracked. By midday, the battlefield had taken on an almost surreal quality. Thick smoke obscured the sky, turning the sun into a dull orange disk. The smell of burning fuel and wet earth mingled with the metallic tang of spent munitions. Soldiers on both sides were exhausted, but for the Germans, fatigue carried an added weight: disbelief. They were not supposed to be on the back foot here. Their panzers were symbols of dominance. Yet now they were trapped by a weapon that weighed less than a single tank shell. For the Americans, confidence grew, not recklessly, but with a quiet, hard-earned assurance. They had held the line against some of the most formidable armored units in the world, not with numbers, but with tactics. They had turned terrain into a weapon, patience into power. The German counterattack had failed to regain momentum. Commanders called for regrouping, for pulling back to more defensible positions. But retreat through narrow, broken roads was almost as dangerous as advancing. Bazooka teams had anticipated this too, setting up along likely withdrawal routes, ready to strike again when the enemy turned their backs. The tide of the battle was turning in ways neither side fully understood yet. It wasn't just about this road, this column, this fight. It was a glimpse of the future of warfare, where speed and steel could be undone by strategy, nerve, and a single, well-placed shot.
By the afternoon, the countryside had become a smoldering labyrinth of shattered ambitions. What had begun as a calculated German counterattack now unraveled into a tense, chaotic struggle for survival. Columns that once advanced with mechanized precision were now splintered and scattered, forced into defensive postures by an enemy that refused to meet them on their terms. The mighty panzers, designed to dominate open plains and crush resistance through shock and momentum, now crept cautiously through narrow lanes, wary of every corner. The sound of their engines, once symbols of power, now carried a note of hesitation. German field officers scrambled to impose order. Messengers darted through the hedgerows, radios hissed with incomplete instructions, and armored units received conflicting orders, some to push forward, others to fall back and regroup. Every decision carried risk. To advance meant risking another ambush. To retreat meant navigating roads already targeted by bazooka teams and artillery observers. The terrain, the Americans, and the clock itself were against them. American forces, by contrast, operated with a fluid, almost predatory patience. Small teams moved between concealed positions like hunters in familiar woods. They didn't need to rush, they only needed to wait. Every German tank that edged forward became another target. Every movement down a narrow road, another opportunity. Artillery batteries adjusted their fire with uncanny precision, zeroing in on stalled vehicles and choke points. Overhead, reconnaissance planes circled methodically, relaying real-time intelligence to units on the ground. What the Germans experienced as confusion, the Americans shaped as coordination. In one sector, a German panzer column tried to force its way through by sheer will. Engines roared, treads churned up the mud, and infantry advanced in tight formation alongside the tanks. For a brief moment, it looked as though the offensive might regain its footing, but then came the telltale sound, the sharp, hissing rush of a bazooka rocket slicing through the air. The lead tank exploded in a blinding flash, its turret lifting slightly before slamming back down. The column froze. Seconds later, a second rocket struck the rear vehicle, trapping the rest between burning wrecks. The infantry scattered, diving for ditches and hedgerows, their shouts drowned out by the roar of fire. For the crews trapped inside the remaining tanks, the sense of invincibility was gone. The steel walls that had once protected them now felt like cages. Visibility was limited, movement was constrained, and the enemy seemed to materialize from the landscape itself. Some tanks fired blindly into the hedges, hoping to flush out attackers. Others popped smoke in a desperate bid to conceal their retreat. But smoke didn't stop rockets. It only turned the battlefield into a dense, choking fog where panic thrived. American soldiers moved with calculated efficiency. Bazooka teams shifted positions after each shot, never staying in one place long enough for retaliation. Machine gunners covered the infantry's flanks, while artillery spotters continued to adjust the rain of shells with eerie precision. It wasn't a large-scale assault. It was pressure. Relentless, disciplined, and intelligent. Every German move met a quiet, devastating response. The psychological toll on the Germans was mounting. For years, their armored doctrine had been the sharp spearhead of their military machine. Tanks had broken armies, crushed defenses, and carried their flag across continents. But here, in these tangled lanes of hedgerow country, that spearhead had dulled. They were being dictated to, forced into reactions rather than actions. Veteran tank commanders muttered to themselves, recalling the sweeping campaigns in France and Russia, trying to reconcile those memories with the grim reality outside their periscopes. By late afternoon, the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Fires still burned where tanks had fallen, their columns of smoke twisting into the sky. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, gunpowder, and earth torn apart by war. Both sides were exhausted, but the Americans held the initiative firmly. The Germans, unable to break through, began consolidating their positions. Engineers rushed to establish makeshift defensive lines, while field officers coordinated artillery to cover their withdrawal. It was not the triumphant push they had envisioned. It was a fight to avoid disaster. For the Americans, this was more than just holding ground. It was proof. Proof that their tactics, their weapons, and their soldiers could stand against the best mechanized force of the era. They had met the Panzer spearhead and blunted it, not with overwhelming numbers, but with strategy, courage, and a weapon that weighed less than a man. As night crept closer once again, the battlefield fell into an uneasy lull. The Germans were not defeated, but they were stalled, bruised, and forced to rethink their approach. The Americans, hidden in the darkness, prepared for whatever would come next. This was no longer simply a clash of machines. It had become a battle of minds.